There is a silence that speaks louder than thunder. It does not beg to be heard, yet it commands attention. It does not impose itself, yet it unsettles. It holds no sword, yet it disarms. This silence is not born of ignorance or passivity, but of mastery. It is the silence that Machiavelli understood, a silence forged not in the absence of power, but in its perfection. For in a world that is increasingly noisy, reactive, and performative, silence becomes a form of psychological sovereignty. It is the final word uttered without speech, the last move made without motion. To argue is to expose oneself. It is to reveal your stakes, your triggers, your emotional investment. And as Niccolò Machiavelli, the infamous political strategist and author of The Prince, well knew, to reveal is to risk. The moment you step onto the battlefield of verbal confrontation, you surrender your element of surprise. You show that you care enough to respond. You show that you can be provoked. And in the art of power, that is weakness masquerading as conviction. The seduction of argument lies in its illusion of control. We believe that through reasoned debate we can persuade, that through eloquence we can dominate. But persuasion is rarely logical. It is emotional. People do not change their minds because they were out-reasoned. They change because they feel compelled to. And the tragic irony is that argument rarely compels, it confronts, pushes, and in pushing it awakens ego. The ego, once stirred, becomes immovable. The more you argue, the more the other resists, not because your logic fails, but because they now have something to defend: their pride. This is why the most powerful men do not argue. They speak little. They listen more. They act without explanation. They understand that silence is not retreat. It is not submission. It is strategy. To remain silent in the face of provocation is to deny the enemy their chosen terrain. It is to remain invisible on the battlefield, letting others swing at shadows. And as they exhaust themselves in the theater of emotional warfare, you remain still, calculating. Machiavelli was not alone in this understanding. Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese general and author of The Art of War, echoed similar sentiments. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Robert Greene, the modern-day curator of timeless strategies in the 48 Laws of Power, likewise declares, "Always say less than necessary." All three understood the fundamental rule. The more you speak, the more you reveal. And what is revealed can be used against you. To argue is to bleed in public. It is to hand your opponent a map to your psyche. Each word becomes a breadcrumb that leads to your inner landscape. Your values, your insecurities, your need to be understood. But the man who does not argue is unreadable. He is unfathomable. He becomes a source of unease precisely because no one can tell what moves him. His silence creates projection. Others begin to guess, to speculate, to fear. And fear, not logic, governs allegiance. In politics, this dynamic is magnified. A leader who explains too much weakens his aura. The more he justifies, the more he appears guilty. The more he argues, the more he validates his opposition. But the leader who moves in silence, who lets policy and consequence speak in his place, becomes something larger than argument. He becomes inevitability. And inevitability is irresistible. Consider the courtroom, the ultimate stage of rhetoric. A lawyer who over-argues risks alienating the jury. A defendant who reacts emotionally to every accusation confirms the image of instability. But a calm, measured presence disarms suspicion. It invites curiosity. It creates doubt. Not in the silent man, but in those who clamor too loudly. In business, the executive who defends every email, every decision, dilutes authority. His colleagues sense desperation. But the one who listens, speaks when necessary, and lets results render judgment, he gains reverence. His silence is not void. It is pressure. People lean in when he speaks because he so rarely does. And in love, argument transforms intimacy into theater. It replaces connection with competition. To argue in relationships is often to prove rather than to understand. It is the ego fighting to be seen rather than the soul longing to be felt. But the person who chooses restraint over reaction, who waits, who recalibrates, who responds with clarity instead of combustion, that person holds emotional gravity. They are not immune to feeling, but they are immune to being dragged into emotional chaos. This is not coldness. This is mastery, emotional mastery, the art of not allowing your internal state to be dictated by external volatility. And Machiavelli, ever the pragmatist, recognized this form of control not as virtue, but as necessity. In The Prince, he advised rulers to appear merciful, faithful, humane, but to be ready to do the opposite when needed. Why? Because the appearance of virtue is useful. Argument, however, threatens that appearance. It unveils what should remain veiled. Silence, on the other hand, is unassailable, cannot be misquoted, cannot be distorted, carries no evidence, no liability, no tells. In the court of public opinion, in the war rooms of diplomacy, in the arenas of social media, silence is the one weapon that cannot be used against its wielder. And paradoxically, it is often the most persuasive, because silence does not push, it pulls. It draws others into its orbit. It makes them question. It makes them listen harder. It creates space. Space in which assumptions, fantasies, and projections bloom. And in that space, power expands. It is gravity without movement. This is why the composed man is feared. Not because he is violent, but because he is immune. You cannot bait him. You cannot decipher him. You cannot rattle him into revealing his hand. He does not fight for the last word. He does not fight to be seen. He is already seen. He does not fight to be right. He is already right within himself. To refuse to argue is not to refuse engagement. It is to refuse entrapment. It is to recognize that most arguments are not about truth, but territory. They are invitations into emotional traps, battles designed not to be won but to be waged endlessly. And the wise do not fight endless battles. They conserve. They wait. They strike when it matters. There is a peculiar alchemy in restraint. The man who listens more than he speaks gains more information. The man who pauses before he responds reveals less. The man who allows others to fill the silence learns what moves them, what scares them, what they need to be seen. And knowledge, as always, is power. In every room there is a center of gravity. Sometimes it is the loudest person, but more often, it is the one who does not speak unless it counts. The one who measures his words. The one whose silence commands more attention than another's monologue. That person holds the frame. They set the emotional tone. And once you set the tone, you set the terms. You are no longer reacting. You are directing. To master this art is not easy. The ego resists it. The ego wants to prove, to fight, to win in real time. But power is not about real time. It is about long term. It is not about the skirmish. It is about the campaign. And in that campaign, silence is not absence. It is calculation. So the next time you are baited into an argument, ask yourself, is this worth revealing myself? Is this worth giving them a map to my emotions? Or would silence serve me better? Not passive silence, but strategic silence. The kind that holds weight. The kind that creates curiosity. The kind that Machiavelli would admire. Because in the end, true power is not loud. It does not shout to be heard. It does not plead to be understood. True power is quiet. Not because it lacks force, but because it lacks insecurity. It does not chase approval. It does not chase understanding. It simply is. And the man who understands this, who lives this, becomes something rare in a world of noise. Unshakable, unreadable, undeniable. He becomes the silence that bends the room. The silence that commands respect. The silence that wins without fighting. Yet to adopt such silence is to practice not detachment but deep awareness, and intimacy with consequence. It is to feel the weight of each word not spoken, to sense the reverberation of each pause. Silence is not the absence of voice. It is the music between notes. It is the echo of meaning left unsaid, vibrating in the minds of listeners longer than any speech. In silence, the mind sharpens, the soul listens, and time bends. One begins to inhabit not just moments, but meanings. And so, silence is not just power. It is art. It is the architecture of presence. It is the sculpture of restraint. The man who walks into a room and carries silence with him alters its dimensions. Others adjust themselves around him. For he is not merely there, he is felt. And in being felt, he exerts a pull stronger than persuasion. He becomes the stillness that speaks the future into being. Thus, silence is not the absence of action. It is the highest form of it. For only those who know the noise intimately can choose silence deliberately. And in that deliberate act lies not just control but creation. A new reality. One shaped not by the friction of voices, but by the gravitational elegance of quiet authority. Thank you for accompanying. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below so we can discuss. Wish you and your family good health.